pawn c2, c4, pawn e7, e5, knight b1, c3, knight g8, f6, knight g1, f3, knight b8, c6, pawn d2, d4, pawn e5 takes pawn d4, knight f3 takes pawn d4, bishop f8, b4, bishop c1, g5, pawn h7, h6, bishop g5, h4, pawn g7, g5.
Unexpected but a stroke that is characteristic of the German player.
Bishop h4, g3, pawn d7, d6, rook a1, c1,
better would have been 9, e3 or 9, f3.
Knight c6 takes knight d4, queen d1 takes knight d4, bishop c8, f5, pawn h2, h4.
Question mark. A considerable loss of time. 11. f3 would be better.
King e8, d7.
Intrepid and well inspired. If now.
Bishop g3, e5.
Then.
Bishop b4, c5. Bishop e5 takes knight f6. Bishop c5 takes queen d4. Bishop f6 takes queen d8.
With advantage to black.
Rook c1, d1. Knight f6, e4. Queen d4, e5. Bishop b4 takes knight c3. Pawn b2 takes bishop c3. Knight e4 takes bishop g3. Pawn f2 takes knight g3.
Also after 15, queen takes g3 b6. Black would have the better game.
Bishop f5, g6. Pawn h4 takes pawn g5. Queen d8 takes pawn g5.
At this moment white has some counter-attacking chances and Keres makes use of them with the ingenious spirit in which he specializes. This opportunity could be avoided by means of 16. H takes g5 17. Rook takes h8, queen takes h8, and white's disorganized pawns would guarantee black a good endgame.
Queen e5, f4. Rook a8, e8. Rook d1, d5.
Forcing the undoubling of one of the pawns.
Queen g5 takes queen f4. Pawn g3 takes queen f4. Pawn b7, b6. King e1, f2. Pawn h6, h5. Pawn e2, e3. Pawn h5, h4. Bishop f1, e2. Bishop g6, e4. Rook d5, g5. Rook e8, g8. Bishop e2, g4. King d7, c6. Rook g5 takes rook g8. Rook h8 takes rook g8. Rook h1 takes pawn h4. King c6, c5. Bishop g4, f3. Bishop e4 takes bishop f3. King f2 takes bishop f3. King c5 takes pawn c4.
In spite of all his efforts, the White King has not succeeded in counterbalancing all the advantages that his rival obtained in the opening. However, as we shall see later on, this advantage should not be decisive.
Rook h4, h7. Rook g8, f8. Pawn g2, g4. King c4 takes pawn c3. King f3, e4. Pawn c7, c5. Pawn g4, g5. Pawn c5, c4. King e4, d5. King c3, b4. Pawn e3, e4. Pawn c4, c3. Rook h7, h2. Rook f8, c8. Rook h2, c2. Pawn b6, b5. Pawn f4, f5. Pawn a7, a5. King d5 takes pawn d6.
Question mark. The decisive mistake. Instead of this unfortunate move, necessary was 38. kd4 with good chances of salvation. Let us look at two principal variations. If the following option
King d5, d4. Rook c8, g8. Rook c2, g2. Pawn c3, c2. Rook g2 takes pawn c2. Rook g8 takes pawn g5. King d4, d5. Rook g5, g4. Rook c2, e2. King b4, c3. King d5 takes pawn d6. King c3, d3. Rook e2, f2.
If the following option
King d5, d4. Pawn a5, a4. King d4, d3. King b4, a3. Rook c2 takes pawn c3. Rook c8 takes rook c3. King d3 takes rook c3. Pawn b5, b4. King c3, d4. Pawn b4, b3. Pawn g5, g6.
next in the game was
King b4, c4. pawn e4, e5, pawn b5, b4, king d6, d7, rook c8, a8, pawn e5, e6, pawn f7 takes pawn e6, pawn f5, f6, pawn a5, a4, pawn g5, g6, pawn b4, b3, pawn a2 takes pawn b3, pawn a4 takes pawn b3, rook c2 takes pawn c3, king c4 takes rook c3, pawn f6, f7, pawn b3, b2, pawn g6, g7, pawn b2, b1, pawn f7, f8, queen b1, b7,
Question mark. Immediately decisive was 48. Queen b5 check because if 49. King takes e6 then 49. Rook a6 check winning in a few moves.
king d7 takes pawn e6, rook a8, a6, king e6, e5, queen b7, b5, king e5, f4, rook a6, a4, king f4, g3, queen b5, d3, queen f8, f3, rook a4, a8, pawn g7, g8, rook a8 takes queen g8.
Here or on the previous move exchanging queens would have sufficed.
King g3, h2, rook g8, h8, king h2, g1.
A king that does not want to resign.
Rook h8, g8, King G1 H2. King C3 C2. Queen F3 C6. King C2 D1. Queen C6 F3. Queen D3 E2.
After this move, White resigned.